Recently, a video showing a Ukrainian Leopard 2 engaging a Russian armored column was published on the internet, and it is quite exciting to say the least, mainly because the leading vehicle in the column is a Russian T-72 tank, which is engaged and engages back the Ukrainian Leopard 2, specifically Leopard 2A4. The video shows a well-camouflaged Leopard 2A4 on a road behind a defensive position, and honestly it is really well camouflaged. When I first saw the video on my phone, I could barely see it. Then we see a Russian armored column coming down the road. The column is then engaged by the Leopard 2A4, and the vehicle in the back, which appears to be either a BMP or an MTLB, is struck by a projectile fired from the tank, but it appears to keep driving. A bit later, another vehicle, or the same one, is hit by the Leopard. Either way, it's some type of an armored transport. But then the lead vehicle, the T-72, gets hit, and immediately after it returns fire on the Leopard, meaning that the first hit did not actually neutralize the tank since it fired back and kept moving down the road. The Leopard 2 then engaged another vehicle in the back of the column. Perhaps the crew thought that the tank was neutralized since they could see the flames coming out of it. I will touch onto this in a bit, don't worry. But the tank is obviously still operating without any issues, so the Leopard 2 crew decides to hit it again. And it was at that time that the T-72 started turning around, exposing its weaker side and rear armor, which is where it got struck and seemingly penetrated, since we can see that the smoke is coming out of the vehicle. This is exactly why I keep repeating in all of my videos that the terrible reverse speed of the Russian T-72 and T-90 tanks is one of the worst things about them. If this tank had 20 to 30 km/h reverse speed like the Western tanks instead of 4, there would have been no need for the crew to turn their tank around and expose the weak side and rear armor to the enemy. But for some reason, some people are still in denial that this is actually a problem. It obviously is. This is yet another drop in the pile of evidence that we have that the reverse speed is one of the main issues of these tanks. Now, how do we know that this was a T-72 tank, and how do we know that this was actually a Leopard 2 tank shooting at them? Well, unlike an old video which was originally claimed to be a Leopard 2 taking out a Russian T-72, where we could just see an explosion in the tank and nothing else, meaning it could have easily been the artillery, this time we actually see the tracers coming in towards the vehicles, and the surroundings match quite well. The projectiles are also very likely heat projectiles, at least the first couple of them fired, which Leopard 2A4 tanks should be equipped with, meaning that it is very likely that it was indeed this Leopard 2A4. If it wasn't, then it must have been another tank, since it is obvious that they are being fired at by a tank and not artillery or any rocket-propelled AT weapon. But since the surroundings and the time of the day match pretty well, I am pretty confident in saying that yes, it was the Leopard 2A4 that engaged the column. Next, how do we know that the leading vehicle in the column is a T-72? Well, first of all, let's first see why it is a tank. In some frames, you can see the main gun pretty well, and when the vehicle fires back, we can see that it is a single big shot and not something like an autocannon. BMP-1 and BMP-3s do have main guns, but they are short, and the silhouette of this vehicle matches pretty well with the silhouette of a main battle tank. And how do we know it is a T-72? Simple, the exhaust. T-72 tanks have an exhaust to the left side of the hull. Other tanks like T-64 and T-80 have exhausts in the back, and we can see the exhaust smoke coming out of the left side of this tank while it is driving. The only other tank this could be is a T-62, but considering that they are rarely used in offensives like this, and even rarer as lead vehicles, I'm far more inclined to say that this is a T-72. But I honestly couldn't tell you which T-72 this is exactly. It could be anything from a T-72A to a T-72B3M. The quality of the video is just too poor to tell any details apart. Now, how do we know those are heat shells, and why did the tank survive the first hit even though we could see the flames coming out of the spot where it was hit? Well, I'm more inclined to believe those are heat shells because of their velocity and effect on target. They seem to be exploding rather than creating sparks like APF-SDS shells. The T-72 was able to survive the hit because it appears to have been struck in the lower front plate, in the area of the fuel tank. So either the fuel absorbed the rest of the remaining penetrating power of the heat jet, and fuel is decent enough at doing that, or the hit came at an angle and did not enter the crew compartment, and fuel of course caught fire, and that is why we could see the flames coming out of the tank. Now, the last hit that took out the T-72 might have been an APF-SDS shell, since we can see that it struck the tank at a much higher velocity than the previous shells that were fired, as well as sparks being thrown to the right side of the tank, which is really typical for the hits made by APF-SDS shells. And it would make sense, they engaged armored transports with heat, which is standard practice. fired one on the lead vehicle, didn't see an effect, switched to APFSDS since they probably realized it was a tank, and finished it off. And the fact that the T-72 turned around also helped them out in that. It pretty much guaranteed that the tank would be penetrated, and it obviously was, meaning that this battle was won fair and square by the Leopard 2A4. Also, we don't know if the Leopard 2 was hit or what kind of projectiles the Russians were firing at it. If it was one of the older T-72 tanks that took part in this battle, it's possible that they couldn't even see the tank, and if they were hitting it, it is possible that they also used heat shells, since it is not that uncommon for them to do that even when engaging tanks, meaning that even if they managed to strike the tank, it is very likely that they couldn't do anything to it, since Leopard 2A4's main armor is more than good enough at stopping the tank-fired heat shells. But you see, that is not the end of the story. There is actually a longer version of the video, and some footage we got from the Russians the following day. The longer video shows other T-72 tanks taking fire as well, but the hits seem to be hitting the cages on the tanks and some other non-vital spots, because even after taking hits they do keep driving away. Russians published a couple of photos of one T-72B3M claiming it was targeted and damaged by a Leopard 2A4, where the radiator was damaged and later the engine stalled, but only after it allowed the crew to retreat far enough so the tank could be recovered. The damage on the tank looks rather odd, but it is possible it was a tank with a turtle cover. It might have been struck by a heat shell on the cover and the jet damaged the tank, because if the heat shells would have impacted the tank directly, there would have been clear explosion marks. That is only if it is indeed a tank from the video, but sadly we don't have any way of being 100% sure. So at least one T-72B3 was taken out and 2 more have been damaged. But what happened to the Leopard 2? Well, it might have been taken out as well. In one frame of the longer video, and I do mean one single frame, which is very hard to see and was probably left in by mistake, we can actually see the position of the Leopard 2, and it seems like the Russian tanks were actually hitting it when they were returning fire. We know it is the same position by the curve in the road and the zigzag trenches right next to it, as well as the tree line behind the road. But because the Leopard 2 actually kept firing back, I believe that they were most likely shooting it with heat shells, since those are very common and would actually do very little damage to the Leopard 2, whose armor is more than adequate enough at stopping tank-fired heat shells. They probably did not expect to encounter any heavy armor in the area, but a day later we got a video from Russians targeting some Leopard 2A4 tanks with drones. And the first one they target seems to be right behind the tree line of the position where the original Leopard 2 was positioned when shooting at the Russian tanks. And it is abandoned. Hatches are open. In a close-up view of the tank, we can also see what appears to be a piece of the camo net on the back of the turret, which could indicate that the tank is in fact the original Leopard 2A4 from the first video. The rest of the camo net could have easily been ripped off and blown away by the explosions of the shells impacting the tank. And it would also indicate that the Russian tanks might have actually damaged something on the tank while they were firing back at it, at least enough to prompt the crew to abandon it. But I just want to say that it is possible that it is a different Leopard 2A4 that was damaged by something else. We don't know how much time has passed between the engagement and the Russians targeting the tanks with the drones. The first Leopard 2 could have drawn away and another one simply drove near the same position. But it is also very likely to be the same tank. Sadly, it is impossible to know. I say this because we know that at least several Leopard 2A4 tanks were present in the area and some of the shots later in the video might have been fired by different tanks. We know there were several of them because in the Russian video they also target another Leopard 2A4 driving on the road in the same area, which gets hit by a drone and stops. Neither of the two Leopards seem to have been destroyed, but they have been damaged nevertheless. If we consider that the Russians damaged one Leopard 2A4 with the tanks, it would be one destroyed Russian T-72 and 2 more damaged, while the Ukrainians would have 1 damaged Leopard 2, all in the initial engagement. But the drones did do some part later on. So I really don't know who you can really say won the entire engagement, but the Leopard, or the Leopards, definitely won the initial tank-on-tank engagement. That would be all. If you like my content, you can support me on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Have a nice day.